So lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. This is my first time back in Ireland House since I headed up to Ithaca. And that wouldn't have been remotely possible without you, Loretta, without Judith, without all of you, friends and colleagues and students. And it's joyful. It's overwhelming for me to be back here and to have the chance to introduce my friend and my teacher, Colm Toibín. In the 3 years that I was fortunate enough to teach here, I'm sure I wasn't the only teacher to have this, but I kept a box of tissues in my office for the rare occasions when students would cry, when there would be tears. My students cried for one of two reasons. Either some tyrant had given them a grade with a minus after it, or they had a profound and unexpected encounter with Colm Toibín's work. I don't mean unexpected in that I sprang it on them. I didn't just say now read Colm. I mean unexpected because they hadn't thought a novel or a play could do what Colm makes these forms do. Unexpected in the sense the future always is, beyond our knowing and yet formed slowly, patiently from labors of routine and rituals of care and a certain delicacy with expectations. Unexpected in the sense of the life of Nora Webster, the protagonist of the new novel from which Colm will read tonight, who finds herself living after the death, the life that she finds herself living after the death of her husband, Maurice. Quote, in future, she hoped fewer people would call. In future, once the boys went to bed, she might have the house to herself more often. She would learn how to spend these hours. In the peace of these winter evenings, she would work out how she was going to live. Maybe the power of those lines is proof enough, but I'm not exaggerating in the slightest here about weeping. Maybe the grade part I'm exaggerating because that was kind of a rarity. We've got really, Glucksman House is a beacon and a magnet for amazing students at NYU, and I'm a pushover. But I think back to when I took my class to a performance of Colm's play, The Testament of Mary, on Broadway. And by the time Fiona Shaw's Mary issued her defiant refusal to mourn as others would have her mourn, by the time the lights came up, I stood in the middle of a circle of soggy faces. It wasn't that they were sad. They told me once they could find Kleenex and words to articulate this, that it was the clarifying force of seeing art that refuses to separate consolation from hesitation. There was an experience akin to Nora's when she plays an Archduke trio record on repeat. Quote, she listened to the first movement over and over, relishing the uncertainty of it, as though someone was making an effort to say something even deeper and more difficult, and hesitating, and then giving in to a simpler melody before moving out of it again, into strange, sudden, lonely moments that the violin or the cello played with a sadness that she wondered how these three young people could know about. It was that play of restraint and effort which had moved my students, the complex graciousness of someone making an effort at an uncanny, refined melody. My students and I promise all of you tonight, pulled by a rhythm into darkness and truth. In the peace of these winter evenings, she would work out how she was going to live. As I was rereading Nora Webster on the bus down here, lines from the American poet Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays, looped through my head. Hayden recalls childhood memory of his father rising early and with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. The child Hayden would rise and dress and begin speaking indifferently to him who had driven out that cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Hayden repeats that question, what did I know, in a tone of wondering remorse, sounding the belated and self-consciously futile note of an adult reproaching the child's inability to understand how independence might only emerge from prior need so deep in the love of child and parent that it could have no voice in the past or had a quiet, mild, erring voice. Colm's novel, however, poses this question as a challenge faced by the novelist who would work from the details of his own life, his own grief and fascination, to build a fiction that speaks to a universal need for languages of appreciation, expiation, and when necessary, formidable, inconsolable rage. Nora deals with the intrusions of sympathy. She sings and jokes and protests and watches on television as Ireland traverses the 60s, as Charlie Haughey rises to power, as second wave feminism gets its start in the state's reforms for the protections of widows, as the deepening troubles in the North are processed into the blurred, abstract photographs of her precocious son. Colm's fictional Wexford is an interlaced world now, a shared world that should be ranked alongside Joyce's Dublin. He was fond of the name Nora too, you know. Colm told me to shut up about mentioning Joyce, but sorry. Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha or Hardy's Wessex. Characters from his novels, The Blackwater Lightship, Brooklyn, The Heather Blazing, and the stories in Mother and Sons all make appearances, pay their respects in the chapters of Nora Webster, so you'll just have to read all of them. They're welcome visitors for us readers, if not always for Nora. What did I know? Here on every page of a masterpiece is what Colm knows of love's austere and lonely offices. So please join me in welcoming Colm.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. We worked together, Greg and myself, in Princeton, and that whole idea of the relationship between that what we might call Irish literature, that strange dotted line that goes from the Táin or from the mythology to the present, where it's only in recent years that dotted line has become almost more interesting than a lot of very clear lines. There's an essay by Seamus Heaney. It's an introduction to the selected essays of Thomas Flanagan, which is published by the New York Review of Books. And in that essay, Heaney's extremely interesting about going to Berkeley, even in the late 1960s, after his first book had come out, and teaching for a year, and having Thomas Flanagan there with him, who had written, I think it's a pioneering book. It was a PhD thesis under Lionel Trilling at Columbia, which became a book called The Irish Novelists. And we think, well, the Irish novelists had to be Joyce and Beckett, but he dealt with the Irish novelists before that. He dealt with William Carleton, John Banham, Somerville and Ross, and poor old Lady Morgan. And he was talking about the Irish novel before Joyce, and talking about the ways in which these novelists were actually no use to Joyce, that Joyce had to begin from scratch because these figures had left him almost no legacy, and that each of them in their own way had produced something chaotic, untidy and strange. But actually, in recent years, what's chaotic, tidy and strange has become very interesting, especially in universities. And the idea then of trying to establish an Irish canon, and especially trying to do so in various universities, has been, I suppose, the project over the last 20 years. Certainly there were times, and Greg will be aware of this, and where we were teaching something in Princeton, in the realization that this is the first time the words William Carleton have been said in this institution in its long and distinguished history. That somehow or other doing some of these seminars was actually breaking glass. I remember my first year in Columbia, where somebody, one of the students very politely said, Professor, we're a bit puzzled about this Jonathan Swift being Irish, because we did him last year. And I said, well, there was no mention of him being Irish. And I said, well, he did live most of his life in Ireland. He wrote a great deal. He wrote A Modest Proposal. Wasn't written about English babies. It's about Irish babies have to be eaten, and he wrote, etc., as a pamphleteer. But so that, things are sort of going to change. There was another moment, it was in Princeton, where I was on my way to give a lecture on Edmund Spenser, and I met a serious Spenser scholar coming towards me, and just by accident, he said to me, what are you going to do? I said, I know, I'm giving this lecture on Spenser. He said, you are giving a lecture on Spenser? I said, yeah, Spenser in Ireland. He said, Spenser? And Edmund Spenser and Ireland? I said, yeah, he wrote The Faerie Queen in Ireland. He wrote a book called Review of the Present State of Ireland. I said, I never really thought about that. And there's a tremendous fun you can have in The Faerie Queen. There's a wonderful moment where it's in the 7th book, where he has at the end of a line, he has the word file, F-I-L-E. He needs it because he needs a rhyme with style. You look at the word and you realise that the line makes no sense. The footnote in the scholarly edition is no help at all. It's completely wrong. There's only one way you can read the word file. And once you read it that way, it becomes absolutely clear. It's not file, although it's pronounced file within the rhyming scheme. It's, of course, file, F-I-L-E. And once you read it as file, then the stanza makes absolute sense. And so I had a lot of fun with this because I was telling everyone, Spencer, he had Irish. But so this is really just a way of saying that what Glucksman Ireland House has done is to establish a place where this tradition, this strange dotted line, can be studied seriously and can actually. I mean, Heaney talks in that essay. You see, he had studied English at Queen's University, where all his professors were English, and they'd all come from English universities, and therefore there was no such thing as Irish literature. It wasn't merely that Spencer was English. I mean, there is a great case to be made, by the way, for Spencer being English, or Jonathan Swift being an Augustan and being English. But actually that the only Irish writers worthy of study were Joyce and Yeats. That before that there was almost nothing, and indeed after that nothing too. So that figures like Maria Edgeworth and William Carleton, and indeed figures who came later, such as Patrick Kavanagh, were simply not part of any canon. So that it was only when Heaney went to Berkeley and began to work with Thomas Flanagan that he realised something about his own country that, of course, helped him enormously as a poet. And in Station Island, he evokes the presence of William Carleton in his own imagination, and William Carleton on his way to Lough Derg. So that whole idea of how we view the tradition of Irish literature, I think actually nourishes and changes the way actually literature is written in Ireland. In other words, to look at, say, the comic tradition from the mythology or the Táin onwards, I think might help a comic novelist working now. And then, as Greg has pointed out, if you're just, I think tears is a bit strong. I think the book just makes people sad. But if you're trying to write in that sort of tradition of sadness, you actually need to know about George Moore. You need to know, about some aspects of William Carleton, and probably even to go further back as well. Anyway, so I just want to start with that, and I want to say also that I'm not sure. I really wish, maybe up in Cornell, if you could help me with this. You're also smart up there. That I'm not sure when it became possible for novelists to actually put themselves into a novel and to more or less say that while this is a novel and some of it is made up, that most of it is true, and it is some way of examining that I could allow myself to actually look at things that happen and try and put shape on them. I've been reading Sybil Bedford's book, A Legacy, which slowly, it's set actually in the Germany before the First World War, but you slowly realise, when you look at her dates, that the little girl born in 1911 in that book is the author of the book, and that the mother, Caroline, is her mother, and that father, that old rake of a man, is her father, and that what she's doing is she's recreating, re-establishing, reinventing her own background and the generation before her own, so that she can somehow make sense of herself. And it's something that emerges slowly in the book. It emerges also in Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, which he published when he was 25, and which deals with his family in Lübeck and the death of his father, but also how the family built up their business. And he himself, instead of becoming a novelist in the book, he becomes a musician. And he gives himself the great satisfaction of killing himself off. In other words, instead of becoming Thomas Mann, adult, he dies this very melancholy death in Buddenbrooks. But so that there is a tradition which would go into Ireland in the case of something like Portrait of the Artist as a young man, or later on, when I got to know the novelist John McGahern, I would realise more and more. We'd be sitting up late at night and I'd say, "But John," and he'd say, "I know," meaning that was in the book. It was a whole story he'd been telling me. I said, "But John, that's in the book." He said, "Oh, I know." And anyway, this first episode, it's in the book. I mean, there's nothing much to say about it. It's set at Scorthy, County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland. It's probably 1968, and there's a mention later on of Jim and Margaret, who are Nora's very conservative brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and a mention of the boys, who are her two sons, who are Donal and Connor, who are also mentioned. And there's a mention of dinner. I should say that dinner in this particular town, at this particular time, happens in the middle of the day. The idea of having dinner in the evening would have been the most shocking waste of time. I mean, you should be doing your homework. Anyway, so that's when dinner is. On Wednesday morning, she went downtown and had her hair done, talking to Bernie and the hairdressers about a new system of dyeing hair she'd read about, wondering if it was time that she did something about the grey. I wouldn't like it blue, she said. I know what you mean, Bernie replied. And if it was too black, then it would look dyed, and I was never blonde. Everyone in town knows I was never blonde. Is there a good brown, so that it might not look dyed? I could try this one. Bernie showed her a package with a photograph of a woman with curly brown hair that looked natural. Maybe just start off with a small bit, she said. No, the instructions say to use the whole thing, Bernie said. I've used it before. It's very popular. You would be surprised who has it. Well, try it so, Nora said. Once the dye had been applied, Bernie put a nylon net on her head and left her to flick through some magazines. When she saw that she would not be home in time to cook a proper dinner for the boys, she regretted having come here at all and knew that she would have to go soon. She signalled to Bernie, who was now busy with two women who had come in together and appeared to need to consult each other about each clip of the scissors. I'll be right with you, Bernie said. When she came over to remove the net, Bernie told her not to worry or look too closely, as the real change would come only once the dryer and a brush and comb were used. Nora was aware that the two women Bernie had been looking after were studying her closely. Nora wondered if she should not have consulted other women about getting her hair dyed for the first time, but she couldn't think of anyone she could have asked. Both of her sisters, she presumed, dyed their hair, but she'd never heard them talking about it. Slowly, as she watched Bernie working with the hairdryer, she realised that she was being given the hairstyle of a much younger woman, and that the women watching it all happen knew that and were taking it in with considerable satisfaction. The more Bernie worked, the more her hair seemed to look like a wig. She knew that the dye would take time to wash out, but in the mirror she could see how pleased Bernie was with her own work. There would be no point in complaining. It's not a bit young for me, she asked. I think you look great, Bernie replied. The cut is very fashionable at the moment. Well, I've never had a fashionable cut before, Nora said. When it was finished, she knew that anyone who saw her on the way home would think that she had lost her mind, or that she was trying to look like a young woman rather than someone who was recently widowed. It'll take a few days to get used to, Bernie said, but no one has grey hair anymore. Does the dye not look very unnatural? In a few days it will lose that look and people will think you've had it all your life. But you look very worried, but I promise you that by the weekend you'll be delighted with it. You can't wash it out, can you? No, but it will fade and I guarantee that you'll be back here in a month for the same again. I've never known anyone to go back to the grey. But maybe the next time we'll think of putting some highlights in. They're all the rage now as well. Highlights? I don't think so. Outside, she lifted her head high and hoped that all the women in Court Street and John Street would be busy cooking and that none of them would be standing at the door. She prayed that she would meet no one she knew. In her mind, she went through the worst possible encounters, the people who would most deplore the idea that with her husband 6 months in the grave, she had dyed her hair a colour it had never been before. She thought of Jim, her brother-in-law, and knew that she would have to face him and Margaret within a week. They would not know what to think. As she saw Mrs. Hogan from John Street walking towards her, Nora could not tell whether Mrs. Hogan simply did not recognise her, or if she wanted to get by her without making any comment. Just as Mrs. Hogan approached her, she seemed almost to jump. Her face quivered and then she stopped. "Well, that will take some getting used to," she said. Nora tried to smile. "Was it Bernie?" Mrs. Hogan asked. Nora nodded. "I heard she got some new packets in all right. God, I must go to her myself." If Mrs. Hogan, in her apron and a pair of very worn-looking shoes, felt that she had a right to comment on Nora's hair, then there was, Nora felt, no reason why she could not comment in reply. "Well, you know where she is," she said dryly, looking at Mrs. Hogan's hair, clearly suggesting that it could benefit from some treatment. It took Mrs. Hogan a moment to take in the possibility that she was being insulted. Quickly, when she arrived home, she boiled some potatoes and opened a tin of peas and put 3 lamb chops on the pan. When the boys arrived, the potatoes were not ready. She waited upstairs, calling down to let them know that their dinner would be a bit late. She sat in front of the mirror at the dressing table and tried to work out if there was anything she could do to her hair to make it look more normal. She wished she had told Bernie not to use the lacquer, which was sticky and had a sweet smell. As soon as the boys saw her, they both became quiet. Donald looked away while Connor moved towards her. He reached up and touched her hair. "It's all hard," he said. "Where did you get it?" I had my hair done this morning," she said. "Do you like it?" "What's under there?" "Under what?" "Under what you have on your head." "What I have on my head is my hair." "Are you going to go out with that?" he asked. Donald glanced at her again and looked away. Anyway, the painter Tony O'Malley lived in Enniscorthy in the 1940s, and he worked in the bank, and he did a lot of work around the town. I mean, he would go out at the weekends and he would make drawings or watercolours of the landscape and of parts of the town. He came back. He eventually went to St Ives in Cornwall, and he became a member of that group of artists, including Peter Lanyon and Barbara Hepworth in St Ives. And eventually he came back to Ireland for a retrospective, and then he came back to live eventually, but at first came back because it was a touring retrospective of his work, and it came pretty close to Enniscorthy, so he thought he should go back to Enniscorthy. It was almost 40 years since he'd been in the town, but it being Enniscorthy, everyone of course remembered him and recognised him. So as he walked through the town, he met loads of people, and my mother and my aunt had both known him, and there was a lot of talk about Tony O'Malley at that time. But one of the things that happened, which he told me himself, was that this woman came up to him. It was a woman called Pidge Hayes, and he had stayed in their boarding house when he was a bank clerk, almost 40 years earlier. And they talked about various things. And just as she was going, she said, "Tony, by the way, there's that suitcase you left. That's still there. Anytime you want to take that, then that's fine with us." So as he was going, he went to the house, just like, what could possibly be in a suitcase? But the suitcase was full to the top with drawings and gouaches and watercolours. And the work that he thought he had lost along the way, and his wife Jane, they were always knew that there was a big chunk of work missing. There it all was. And the strange thing about it is that it's almost topographical. Even though he's using fauve colours, nonetheless, you can see, if you know the landscape or the town, you can see where he was working. And he writes the name of the place at the bottom and everything. But there's one place you wouldn't know, which is he did a lot of work in Ballyconagher, which is the strand or the beach from the village of Blackwater. And he did drawings and he did watercolours of the hill behind a house called Keating's. The problem is, of course, that hill is not there anymore, that it's been taken away by the erosion. And there was a watchtower at the top of it. And I remember it vividly. It was there till the 1970s. And slowly, so there's no sign of it now. I have a postcard of that landscape, but even people didn't think of photographing it much. There's almost no evidence it ever existed. So you would think that Tony O'Malley must have made up that hill. So that this landscape is the landscape that some of my novels are also set in besides Enniscorthy. It could start at a place called Ballyconagher Upper, which is also called Cush or Cush Gap. And that's really eroding. They don't, people have a funny way of talking. They tend not to, if there's anything difficult to be said, people will tend not to say it. They'll find euphemisms for almost everything. So when my father's first cousin, when his house was about to fall over, it did fall over, and houses are falling over all the time, but people don't like using falling over or erosion. They would just say about somebody, he went into the village. Meaning that since he had no house on the, he had to go somewhere. And of course the first port of call would be the village. But they would say it in a sort of a pointed but sad sort of way. And they'd look at you to make clear that, there was something else they were trying to say. They didn't want to say because it was too hard. Because I was asking about a family because the house had come very close, or the cliff had come very close to it. And someone said, no, you see, they did Christmas there, but once January came, they went into the village. Anyway, if you go south from there, you end up in a place which is called Keating's, and it's also called Ballyconagher Lower. And there's a wonderful thing. There's a river that changes its course every year, and which was always very exciting. And then if you go further along, going south, you're going towards Rosslare. You can see Rosslare. You can see a place called Ballyvaloo, which still has a convent for the Sisters of St. John of God. And it was very exciting when we were growing up there because you'd see nuns. And this was, Vatican II had no effect on the nuns anyway because they were in their full regalia. And you'd be on the Strand, and it'd be a beautiful summer's day, and you'd say, Mammy, look, there's a nun! And there could be two nuns, and they'd look like whales or octopuses or something that had come in from the deep. In their full black regalia. I suppose they were praying, and they were walking along praying. Anyway, it was just a memory from that time. And then if you go further along, you reach Curracloe, where the beach or the Strand gets much longer with sand dunes. It's very like a beach in Normandy, which is why they filmed Saving Private Ryan, the beach scenes on that particular beach. But anyway, what's happened is that Nora has got a job, and she's been bullied at work by a woman who hates her for pretty good reasons actually, and has ended up having a fight with a woman about 11 o'clock in the morning. She almost stabs her with a pair of scissors, but doesn't, and goes outside, and she's in an old car, and realises she's walked out of work, and she's got a scissors in her hand on the street. And then she decides to get into the car, and she decides to go to this place. The village is Blackwater, and then go on to Ballyconagher from there, just because she's nowhere else to go. And she stopped in Blackwater and bought a packet of 10 Carol's cigarettes and a box of matches. She had not smoked for years and promised herself that she would not smoke all of these cigarettes either, just 2 or 3 before throwing the packet away. When she inhaled, she felt dizzy, and that made her remember how tired she was. She's been suffering from insomnia before this, so it's clear that she's really, really tired. She threw the cigarette out the window and then put her head back and fell asleep. When she woke, she spotted a woman standing on the bridge looking over at her car. As the woman approached, she started the engine. So she drives to Ballyconagher. She had not expected to find a haze over the water. She sat in the car in front of Keating's house and looked down in the direction of Rosslare, taking in the heavy milky light that lay over the Strand going towards Curracloe and Raven Point. When she got out of the car, she felt how unusually close and humid it was, as if there was thunder coming. She put on a pair of flat shoes that she kept in the car. There were no other cars in the car park. She walked carefully on the stony stretch between the grass and the river, and crossed a small wooden bridge and made her way south. In all the years she thought she'd never come here even as late in the season as October, She imagined now how strange it would be in December and January, how storm-swept and wintry, and how biting the cold. There was hardly any colour. The world in front of her had been washed down. If she moved nearer the shore, she could look at the small stones that made a rattling sound when the waves broke over them. She saw how exact the colour of each stone was, and it allowed her to forget work and to stop worrying about what she would do. She could barely see ahead of her as she walked. It might have been easy to imagine that this was a place that belonged more to Morris than to her. Morris is her husband, who's dead about 6 months or a bit longer. It was the world filled with absences. There was merely the hushed sound of the water and stray cries of seabirds flying close to the surface of the calm sea. She could make out the sun as it glowed through the curtain of haze. It was unlikely that Morris was anywhere except buried in the graveyard where she'd left him. But nonetheless the idea lingered that if he or his spirit were anywhere in the world, then he would be here. She thought it almost natural that if his spirit were on this stretch of strand, he would have his own concerns, the details of her life, her job, or what might happen in the future with the children. These would be matters that would seem as vague to him as the far distance did now to her, things that would pass as his life had passed. What had happened in the days before his death, the blockage in his system that caused him to cry out so his voice could be heard through the hospital, that would be with him now more than anything else. It came to her again, his death. She pictured those who were there, Jim and Margaret, his brother and Sister Thomas from the convent of St. John of God, who'd said special prayers, and then old Father Quaid. For the last 2 days Nora herself had stayed by his bedside, but he was already far away from them, so far that they might have been like shadows, people already lost to him. Maybe he could only imagine them all as vague presences, the ones he had loved, but love hardly mattered then, just as the haze here now meant that the line between things hardly mattered. As she reached Ballyvaloo, and the luminous grey whiteness was moved down the strand by the mild wind towards Curracloe, she saw that there was a single nun walking back towards the lane that led to the retreat house of the Sisters of St. John of God. Wearing a full black habit, she walked slowly and with a difficulty. Nora thought that she must be one of the retired nuns who often came here on holiday or on retreat. When she was closer, she saw that the nun was Sister Thomas. Nora was surprised she was in Ballyvaloo. She had not known that she ever spent time away from her own convent and the town. She moved towards her, and when she reached her, Sister Thomas greeted her, put out her hands and took both of Nora's hands and held them. Suddenly, Nora felt cold and began to shiver. She could hear wind blowing, almost whistling in the distance. But when she looked out at the sea and down the strand, it all seemed calm. There was no sign of the haze lifting. "You shouldn't be here on your own," Sister Thomas said. "I was in Blackwater this morning to see a friend, and just a while ago she saw you fast asleep in the car, and then driving towards the strand, and she phoned me in the convent because she was worried and wanted to know what she should do. So I walked down here in case I would find you." "Who saw me?" "I thought I would come down to the shoreline to see if you were here," Sister Thomas said quietly. "I don't often leave the retreat house. Today it's more like heaven than earth down here." "I saw her all right," Nora said. "Someone who can't mind her own business." "That is one way of putting it," Sister Thomas said. "Someone who's looking out for you." Sister Thomas released Nora's hands. "I was not surprised to see you down here," she said. "It was meant to happen, us meeting like this. This is how the Lord works." "Don't tell me how the Lord works," Nora said. Don't tell me that again." "When Morris was dying," Sister Thomas said, "I asked the Lord to make it easy for him and for you. I've no needs of my own, and I had not asked him for anything in a long time, but I asked him for that, and he denied me what I asked. There must have been a reason for saying no, and the reason is hidden from us. But I know that he is watching over you, and maybe that is why we met, so I could tell you that." "He has not been watching over me," Nora said. "No one has been watching over me. I knew when I woke today and said my prayers this morning," Sister Thomas said, "that I was to see you." Nora was silent. "So turn back now before the fog comes down so hard that you won't be able to drive home." Sister Thomas said. Go home. The boys will be home soon. The boys will be home from school waiting for you. I can't work in that job anymore, Nora said. She shouted at me. She said things today that made it impossible for me to stay. It will be all right, Sister Thomas said. It is a small town, and it will guard you. Go back to it now and stop grieving, Nora. The time for that is over. Do you hear me? I felt as I walked down here, Nora began. We all feel that on days like this, Sister Thomas interrupted, and even on other days. It is why we come here. Those who have passed on have it for shelter on their way elsewhere. It is nice to be among them on a day like this. Among them? What do you mean? We walk among them sometimes, the ones who've left us. They're filled with something that none of us knows yet. It is a mystery. She held Nora's two hands again and then released them and turned and walked slowly as though in pain, back towards the dunes and the lane leading to the retreat house. Nora waited to see if she would look back, but she did not. So Nora stood for a while without moving, looking out at the sea still covered in haze. And then she began to make her way along the strand towards where she'd left the car. Miss Kavanagh's the scissors were on the front passenger seat beside the packet of cigarettes. She put the cigarettes in the glove compartment, but took the scissors out of the car and left them down on the gravel for someone else to find.